Welcome back to the Budget Gamer channel, where we bring you critical and in-depth reviews of just about every indie game we can get our hands on, and today we're going to be taking a look at Good Night Night for the Nintendo Switch. And if you are wondering, it is in no way related to the book Good Night Night, which is about children's sippy time. But before ado is in any way furthered, let's just jump into the story. The story, or at least the intro scenario in Good Night Night, is pretty hilariously written, and it does set up a bit of initial intrigue to give the player at least a modicum of investment before diving into this dungeonous tower. Initially we see our character, the knight, being ejected from one of the higher floors of said tower, and avoiding falling rocks and even combating some enemies on his incredibly long descent. We find out that he has no memories of who he is or what he was doing or any state of the interior of the tower from those higher floors. Thankfully though, there is a professional quest giver stationed at the bottom who's identified him as a holy diver. And though it's not explicitly written in the dialogue of the text, it's my personal opinion that he may have been out too long at the Midnight Sea. But more or less, in order to stave off some sort of impending evil, our holy diver will have to yet again ascend the tower. The introductory floor or two do act as the game's kind of implicit tutorial, and meeting other characters and failed heroes, we gain access to abilities and learn how to swing our sword, use the shield, jump, and lock onto other enemies. And with a bit of further character dialogue, we learn that the tower works off of an elevator system, which is kind of like the game's checkpoints. But up to this point in the review, I've pretty much just described the Good Night Night as a pure dungeon crawler. And of course the developers might not have made such a big impact if that's all it was. Because there are also elements of the ever-loved and loathed roguelike genres, as well as some RPG elements, with a pretty dynamic item system. As you explore the tower, cutting down bushes, cracking pots, and killing enemies, you'll be picking up all manner of different resource items, whether they are plants, foods, typical resources, or special resources gained from certain enemies. If you manage to make it back out of the tower safely without dying, you can go to one of the characters located outside the tower's ground floor, and they can use these resources to create new items, granting you new abilities. But while certain abilities might be better harvesting of resources, or the ability to jump more quickly, or even increased sneak ability or an increased sword range, they do come with a price. Every single one of these new ability items has its own weight, and you can't carry too many or you won't be able to make it through the dungeon. But while a limited item inventory is generally a pain in the butt for any RPG player, one of the coolest features of Good Night Night is that the character's experience isn't really linked to themselves, it's linked to their items. And every single item that you take into the dungeon benefits from the experience you gain in the longer and longer progressions you make it. And upon leaving the dungeon and resting successfully, all of your items will level up and actually reduce their weight, allowing you to take more and more items and farm more and more abilities. And so in that sense, resource and item farming might be one of the biggest time sinks in the game if you really want to buff out an OP character early on. But that being said, you won't have access to all of the potential items in the game from the very get-go. Good Night Night is divided into dungeon floors, but also into regions of dungeon floors locked off by boss combat. And if you can't beat the boss and get access to a new area, you're not going to get access to those more advanced items in the shop either. And so even if you do grind and get all 100% zero weight items that are available, if you can't make it past that first boss, well, that's going to be a problem. Because the roguelike elements of the game aren't just die and start over at the bottom. The three other resources that you'll have to farm besides those specialty items are your foods, your plants, and your resource little pellets. And these get used every time you rest to refill your health, your potions, and any special items you might have to use, such as your portals. And so if you're not constantly grinding, or you have curses turned on that might delete every one of your farmed resources upon death, then you may be starting out your next dungeon runs with lower health, lower potions, or no resources to craft more upon your next rest. Thankfully though, even if your resources do get absolutely demolished, the lowest health you can start out with is 50%, which while making combat slightly more difficult isn't exactly a game ender. But moving on to the presentation of Good Night Night. Visually, it is full of rich and beautiful pixel art, and I have to say the visuals as well as the item system of the game are probably my two favorite aspects. I wasn't a huge fan of the animations because I felt that they were just a little bit limited, but the actual color and art design of the game was absolutely beautiful. The game's music as well is really, really well done, and it was a surprising diversion from the typical chiptunes that you see paired with 16 and 32-bit graphics. But as I was quite given to farming in the early levels, I did hear quite a few of the tracks repeat quite a few times, and maybe due to my own personal gameplay style, they did get to feel a little bit repetitive. But with all this intricacy and praise to the items, to the combat, to the dungeons leveling system, there are still a few things a player might want to note before diving into Good Night Night. And again, remember, I go into every single gaming experience that I do completely blind. I have no idea what game I'm getting into, and sometimes, because the descriptions in the eShop, I don't even know what the genre is. And so all of my critiques, while definitely grounded in the other 300 games that I've already reviewed, are from personal experience and mostly first impression. And one of the first impressions of the game that stood out to me the most is the slowness of the combat. Now, enemies will attack quickly, but even for your basic sword/attack, it almost feels like it has a certain charging phase and is really, really slow to initiate. And while there are curses that you can find in the game that speed up every aspect of gaming, including your own attack, there's just something about that early attack function that makes the general combat in the game feel a little bit less than organic. And for a hack and slash dungeon crawler, as hacking and slashing are one of the fundamental elements, this deficit will stand out just a bit. But possibly a larger critique than just the slowness of your sword swing is going to have to be in the difficulty spikes in the game. Now, the actual progression through dungeon rooms I think is kind of almost on easy mode, especially if you build your character more towards sneak, increasing sneak speed and the ability to grab enemies, because even if you're not the best at combat, you can just pick up an enemy and toss him against the wall, and in some cases it'll kill him in one hit. And honestly, the stealth aspect of Good Night Night was an amazing addition to a dungeon crawler. But while the levels are fairly seamless in their progression, the boss fights seem to be thrown back into that classic NES and SNES just to beat your head against the wall grinding style, where you'll have to challenge them over and over and over to get the perfect timing or the perfect enemy placement despite somewhat randomized attacks. And while that is actually pretty gratifying and can be very, very rewarding, the roguelike elements of the game that do sacrifice your health if you haven't been grinding previous to your death mean that unless you want to go grind some levels and then fight the boss, you're probably going to be fighting the boss on half health with low potions. And then after dying, you'll need to grind again to make sure you start with full health and full potions, and then die, and then grind, and then die, and then grind. Which can make facing a boss a little bit frustrating. And that actually does bring me to the third critique for the game, which is a bit of the total game's balance. Yes, the general level progression is pretty manageable and the boss fights are pretty difficult. It makes sense why all of the items in the game are locked off according to the boss fights. And that's not only because you'll need certain specific materials from later levels, but because even if you have all of the available items up until that boss fight, you're actually not super OP enough to just go in and dominate. Which makes me feel like possibly having less items that were more powerful and harder to level up would be a much more satisfying experience than hundreds of items that are super easy to level up but don't really give you that big of an advantage. And so taking a step back from the experience, taking a night to sleep on it and really contemplate what it was that I'd played and how it all played out for me, I think at least for myself as a gamer, it all came down to the issue of balance. The writing in the game was good and it was really funny. And the whole premise was really easy to grasp, and the dungeon organizations were organic even though they are randomized. And the enemies and the item systems and the way to farm resources was novel, and actually really entertaining and satisfying to unlock and level up new items. But the balance of the game just seemed off. The slowness of your attacks, the extreme spike for bosses, combined with the frantic need to constantly grind and farm resources every time you die, while the game is certainly manageable, it's probably not going to be as gratifying an experience as it might be to certain niche demographics of gamers. But if you are a fan of roguelikes, even if you're not a fan of dungeon crawlers, then you probably want to give this one a try, especially while it's on sale. But even then, due to the difficulty spikes, you'll have to be the type of gamer who really enjoys that old school boss rush style. But anyway, that does about bring us to the end of the review of Good Night Night now for the Nintendo Switch. So if you enjoyed the review, or especially if you found it helpful, feel free to throw me a comment or a like to show your support. And don't forget to click that little bell icon when you subscribe to stay updated with the latest content. Because as you can see, there are new and unique indie games coming out literally every single day. And even though we can only cover a couple of games a week, we are one of the only channels on YouTube that exclusively covers indie game content. And so whether it's an easy hard pass or an absolutely unforgettable gem, chances are if it's on the Switch, you're gonna find out about it right here. But anyway, this has been The Budget Gamer, so as always, Thanks for watching.